Well, welcome everybody. We appreciate you being here this afternoon. I see some folks that were with us in our first session. Thank you for coming back. I know part of it is about the free lunch. And this time around, for added incentive, we've added notebooks. So if nothing else, you got free lunch and a notebook. But we hope the content is good too. So just to start us off, and we'll get to some specific introductions of our team and colleagues here in a moment, but this is kind of at the point where we want to take the read of the room and just have a little context for those that are here. And so what I'd love to know, and if you feel comfortable raising your hands, is just a little bit of the experience range. So in the room, how many are sort of brand new to the grants process, maybe have written one or two, not done much, okay? How many have a little bit of experience? So maybe over the years you've written a few small ones, $5,000, $10,000 in that range, okay? And then how many are old hands? So you've been at this for a while. I saw some two hands. Yeah, okay, great. Well, so with that, one is that Grants Resource always wants to be here for you. We want to be accessible. We are not an ivory tower. We want to have great conversations. We want to be engaged, and we want to provide you with what you feel is helpful and useful information. You'll hear that from us and that refrain quite often. But I think perhaps more importantly is that you also know you have campus peers and colleagues that are involved at various levels in this work as well. And so if for any reason you can't connect with Holly or I in a timely fashion, as you look around the room and you see those hands that have been raised, I hope everybody feels like they're accessible and can have good conversations with one another as well. And sometimes that's how we get some good ideas generated and get some energy going. And Grants Resource really loves to be a part of that when we can be. So hope that's useful and helpful. We'll go to next slide. So this is where we are. If you are here for the employee meeting, that is in this space. That's a little bit later though. Next slide. And so this is us. My name is Peter Lawson. For those I haven't met or haven't talked with regularly, I'm the director of Grants Resource, and my colleague Holly here is our grants assistant, and probably the person you want to start with if we're being fair. But quite a bit of background in that editorial role. I've shared often and with folks in this group, I think that there is a certain amount of fear I have of her red pen, but that is part and parcel of the gig and the team effort. I also just want to call out that as I spoke about respecting your time earlier, Holly does have a directive that at about 10 till she's going to come out and do this to slow me down and to give folks who need to make that transition and depart the ability to do that, although we'll be on hand for a little bit to answer some questions as well. And then we also want to call out our colleague Diane Ackley, who is the grants accountant. Grants accountant is not specifically associated with the external programs, the org chart that Grants Resource is in, but is obviously a critical part and parcel of how we're thinking about grant budgets, of how we're managing those awards, and how we're implementing that work once we get it on the ground. So next, actually, and I also want to call out Aaron Schmoniak, who's going to give us a little talk here in just a moment. I know you all love hearing from me, but I often think it's far more effective if you're hearing about the work on the ground from our friends and colleagues that are really involved in it. And so part of this series as it progresses is we want to give those folks the opportunity to share their stories, to share their work, as well as providing some info from our standpoint. Okay, next. And so for folks who attended last time, you may recognize this theme. For folks that are attending for the first time, this theme really centers around puppies and money. And part of that is that while you think that it's great to have access to a big bucket of money because that is the resource that helps you do what you want, and who doesn't love an adorable puppy? The context is that oftentimes there is work involved in these grants that is both at the outset, which is what we're going to talk about today, and in implementation, which is a series for another time. And with a puppy, for all the adorableness, they do make messes, and sometimes you have to be involved in cleaning up. And that's to say that both of those elements are a commitment to the work, to the puppy itself, doing a little bit of house cleaning. Hopefully you'll see that theme and how it relates as we move on in this series. Next. You can keep going. Yeah. And so the other key takeaway here is that remember, we're not advocating either way. If you love puppies, get a puppy. If you want to be involved in this grant work, we are here to help. I think the core, next, is we just want to make sure you're prepared. And so if that's informational, if we need to have a conversation on the puppy side or kitty side, you're entirely on your own for those cleaning supplies. But on we go. Next. So with that, I'm going to sit down for a few minutes and we're going to have our colleague Erin talk a little bit about her work and the specific day-to-day elements of how that looks in implementation and whatever else she'd like to share. So Erin Shimoniak, Director of our KSET program.
You navigate? Okay. Okay, well, good afternoon, morning, afternoon, whatever it is now. As Peter said, my name is Erin Shimoniak, and I'm the Director of the KSET program. So I just have a brief overview of KSET, our program, and our grants. So we're going to talk a little bit about how grant funding affects our program. How grant funding affects our program, and what it takes to then manage the grants as well after they've been awarded. So our program, the KSET program, is a Title II basic skills, adult basic skills program. We provide GED, English as a second language, and citizenship preparation classes. We offer morning and evening hybrid classes and then an online GED class. Our classes are made of multi-level students, and when our GED students start with us, about 67% of them come in at or below an 8th grade level. So pretty low levels. So far this year, our term enrollments have averaged about 150 students with about a 60% retention rate so far. Our staffing includes myself as the director. We have an assistant director who's also our data professional. We have a receptionist and then 4 instructors. And then the Title II goals, overall goals, are to help students prepare to gain improved employment, enter workforce training, or post-secondary education. Put these down. If I hold it far enough, I can read. So this year's program funding includes the majority of our funding every year is coming from the general fund, so it's about 61% this year. Another 39% comes from our grants. So we've got 2 grants, 25% coming from the WIOA Title II Adult Education and Family Literacy Grant, which is a 5-year grant. and then 14% coming from the GED Wraparound Grant, which is a 2-year grant. So the Title II grant really drives all of our programming, and then the GED Wraparound Grant and the general fund help support that Title II programming. So even though the Title II grant is a pretty small portion of the funding each year, like I said, it drives everything that we do, including our instruction, our support, and services that we provide for our students. There are many, many grant requirements that come along with Title II, some of which are using a program-specific software, which is called TOPS Pro Enterprise. The software is used to collect and monitor our data that's used for reporting. We're also required to use the CASAS assessment system that measures our student growth, academic growth, and helps to show our program improvement. And then all of our staff have to be certified to proctor the assessments through CASAS. Required reporting includes a series of 23 reports throughout the year. Sometimes that number changes from year to year. They include things like budget and other financial reports, a program improvement plan each year, Title II monitoring questions each year, instructional standards compliance information, staffing reports, and then quarterly data audits, just to name a few. There's quite a few. And then Title II also requires specific professional development. So 11 different required trainings throughout the year, monthly meetings for the director, for myself, and then also for our data professionals or professional. And then we're also required to develop our own professional development plan each year. And then HEC does provide some optional trainings that are available throughout the year as well. And then the grant application process is rigorous and time-consuming, as I'm sure many of you know. The Title II grant was up for renewal last year. We had about an 8-week window, and it really took most of that time frame to complete it. It was a lot of work compiling historical data, collecting new census data, comparing the previous application to the current one, and then also aligning it to the WIOA local plan for the East Cascades region. So this grant specifically is really critical to our funding for our instructors. And then the wraparound grant also was up for renewal last year. That RFP period overlapped the Title II period, so that adds a little extra stress and timing challenges. That grant in particular is really essential to funding our assistant director position, which is our data professional as well. So most of our grant-related tasks, including program management, improvement, and then the reporting, falls on me. But it really takes all of our team to implement it. Everyday work, our instruction, our advising that our assistant director does, everything that Yolanda does, everything that we do goes into helping our students and fulfilling the requirements of this grant. And it really requires all of us to be really, really flexible and have a high degree of empathy and compassion for our student population, which is a very high needs, high touch population. We couldn't do it without the grants office. Holly and Peter provide excellent support for us, especially when we are in the process of applying. The grant analysis that you guys do is super helpful. They help to monitor the question and answers that come along as the grant is open, and then providing updates also, and then without your final edits, and help with the formatting and submission. Yeah, that's super helpful. And then, of course, Diane throughout the year is helping with the financial aspects, all the finance reporting. And very important to have a good relationship with Diane. So this is just really a brief overview of, I'm just barely touching on what KSET does, but trying to show that these grants for our program, even though they're small, they're really critical for us to be able to provide what we provide for our community. So GED and ESL services. So even though they're small in comparison to the amount of work that goes into them, it's really important and allows us to have a positive impact on our students. So that's.
So Erin, when you say small, give us a sense of what that means. I guess I didn't get a sense of what your total budget is, and then 25% is from Title II and 14 from GED background. So give us a sense of what small is.
So the Title II grant this year is $182,000, and the with change, that's not the exact amount. Then the wraparound grant, I want to say, is 106. So the rest of it is coming from the general fund. Any other questions?
You had me at 28 reports. I'm looking around the room and that was up. I don't, you were looking at your paper and it was like, everybody was looking at that going.
Yeah, there's one of these on my board that gets turned over every so often,
Like
a calendar.
every 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, maybe not every 2 weeks, but
Or
often. Yeah, some of them are due all at once, so that's fun.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal number.
Yeah.
I'm sure that some of them are short and sweet and others are.
Some are and some are not. Yeah, and it changes from year to year sometimes. Not a lot, but sometimes they'll throw another one in there.
So when our students change from year to year, and the demographics change from year to year, and who's coming in and who's flowing out, and the success, and I mean that's constant change. That's a lot.
Yeah, well, that's why I say Title II drives all of our programming, even though in relation to the total budget, it's not that much.
But without living inside of their bounds, you don't get into that.
Right, and we need it, obviously.
Wouldn't it be fair to say that part of the reason for the extensive reporting is because the funding is a federal funder?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be accurate to say? So if you weren't applying to a federal funder, the reporting would be less.
Well, this grant is a federal grant, but it goes through the state of Oregon. So everything that we're submitting goes through Oregon, and then they submit to the government.
So we're talking about probably what, $600,000 cost center for your program.
Yep.
Alright.
You guys are back in the corner over there. Okay. Well, thanks. You're welcome. Oh, yeah, sorry.
So I want to say thank you again to Erin. Also, thank you to you all for the questions and the unintentional spoilers of our series on implementation. All right, so now we're going to get into the application, and we've kind of, again, since this is very surface level, we've divided it up into 5 essential core components. And so next slide. So we're going to start with number 1, and that really, in most instances, is a statement of need. And so a lot of times when we originate an application, we're starting with a call to Bill's office that is asking the question, what's our broad level current institutional demographic, enrollment, those components, and then we'll take that information and we'll put it side by side with regional census data that talks about key elements like unemployment, poverty, capacity. Sometimes we'll look at Oregon Employment Department to look at potential job growth if we're talking about a specific sector or programming. But really what we're trying to get to is an explanation to whoever the funder is, whether that's federal, state, or regional funder like Ford Family Foundation. We want to talk about why they should be interested and really what problem, if it is that we have, and how that entity is going to be involved in helping us get to a solution because of that funding. And so that is something that if you are having a conversation with us and we're going to originate something together or we're going to work on a collaborative piece, that's usually the starting place. But we also always want to be informed by you, by your division, by your department, by your work, that if there's a specific student story, or if there's a group of students working on a particular project, we love the details about that, because those individual stories or those stories of what's happening specifically in your program are only helpful in the context of what we submit to a funder. So that's number one. What's the story? And that oftentimes is context that Holly and I don't have and will need from you. So that's kind of what starts us off. Next, please. Next piece is really around, we call it program description. That's often the sort of heading in any given application, but it really is around your goals. And so I've had a mentor of mine over the course of the years who describes this in terms of paint done. And you ask, well, what does that mean? And so did I, by the way. And what that really means is that you're going to explain to us first and us up through to the funder what this looks like. We have $100,000 from any given source, what that money has accomplished at the end of whatever performance period it is. So I know, for instance, in the Wildland Fire Program, it's about $500,000 over 5 years, a little over that. But what has happened with that investment? What does it look like after that organization has put those dollars into that investment? What have we achieved, or what do we think we're going to get to, we're going to make our best run at because of that infusion of resources? And sometimes it's actual dollars. Sometimes it can be a piece of equipment if we're thinking about the apprenticeship center across the way, or if we're describing a capital project, again, like the apprenticeship center, we're saying, yes, these dollars are on the building, but here's what the building or the piece of equipment or the investment in the students themselves is going to look like at the end of this time period that we've spent that out, that we've made those changes, that we've built that structure. And so, questions on that? Yes, please.
Yeah, the goals should be like bullet points, or they should be described as a paragraph?
Yes. So it really depends on the grant. And a lot of times we can describe them as bullet points if they're that straightforward. Sometimes we have funders, and especially at the federal level, that will want us to expand on that and go into great detail about it. And whereas Ford Family is an Oregon foundation, and they are much more about tell us your story. So we're gonna graduate 25 students in this demographic because we had the scholarship dollars, and that's just a bullet point, and that's what we submit. And so really when we start talking, those are some of the things we want to figure out is what level of detail do we need to provide to the funder to make it a strong argument? And sometimes it's really simple, and sometimes you can put 3 pages into it and still not feel like you've met that funder requirement. So kind of case by case.
Thank
Yeah.
Do you think there is a sorry? Do you think there is a determinant to state if you're getting the grant or not? I'm asking that because I worked in a USDA grant for
Yeah.
my PhD, and we got for that $500,000. But for example, my advisor at another time, he wrote a grant for like $10,000 and he didn't get it. And it's not, I don't know. It's not about how much money you're asking.
Yeah.
I think it's all about the way you write. But do you think what would be a determinant point to approve a grant?
If I had that answer, we'd probably have a lot more funding. But the short version is, and the work that especially Holly is always helping us with, is trying to get into the mind of the funder and be specifically responsive to the questions in the application that are asked. And so, the Economic Development Administration is a big federal agency, and it's one of those where we had to do a lot of reading and rereading of the request for proposal information so that we knew the funder is expecting this information in this level of detail with this amount of documentation. And because of being able to read through that again and again and really get to the meat of what's on the checklist, what are they expecting, and address that to the very best of our ability. The other challenge is sometimes you don't know what the exact construction budget is that you're asking for because you haven't had the dollars to pay the architect to do the planning. And so those are little rabbit trails we can get down. I think the short answer for us and the default is always go back to the RFP and always be looking to the best of our understanding about what we think that expectation is. And the difficulty, and let's just own it, is that sometimes you have read through that document, you've compiled all of your information, you've provided the bullet point and the backup and the context and the need, and the panel reviewer on the day that is being opened up and looked like has a stomach ache and isn't feeling well, and something upsets them, or something isn't already sitting right down here, and then something isn't sitting right in your proposal, and that can put the whole thing to the side too. So it's a little bit of it is a volume game, and then I think the other thing we talk about is conversations about. And this is actually a little later in the presentation, but I'll jump ahead just a bit. Sometimes we do get that rejection, and as often as it's possible and as often as we can ask for it, and USDA and many of the federal funders are pretty good about this, we can ask them, what did we miss? We can ask them, why was this declined? And oftentimes they will give you a 2-page sheet of what that panelist's opinion was in that moment that you can be a little bit responsive to as you're going forward. So I realize that was not a great answer, but that's the answer, and that's part of the work that we're involved with. And if that happens and we're working with you on something along that lines, then we archive all of that, and we're going to go back to that analysis, hopefully when there's a new annual cycle, and we try again. And we've had a number of programs that we have said, gosh, we didn't get it right the first time, let's go back again. And I think there's the Title III grant that we have on campus where it took the institution 3 different times. And finally we had the right information in front of the right panelist on the right day, and we got it. So that's the other part of the commitment and the work as well.
So Peter, what was the question? So we couldn't hear the question.
So the question was, what level of information are we requiring? Is it always just a bullet point? We need more context. What helps us make them? How do we ensure that we're putting the information in front of the funder that is going to get us to the award? Is that, yeah. So back to program description and goals. And here's my really basic sample. Next. So let's say that your goal is to defeat the Rebel Alliance. Because if the rebel scum are defeated, the empire wins and order is restored. So that's my big goal. That's where I want to get to. That's me painting done, is the rebels are defeated and order is restored and the regime continues. So let's go to number 3 here. So the project plan, which is the third component, is what am I going to do? How am I going to get to that big goal? So here are the specific things I'm going to buy. Here's the specific action I'm going to take. So I've already identified what I hope are my outcomes, and then what is my roadmap? What is my checklist? How am I going to get there? And so in the example I just used, first, the equipment that I'm going to purchase and plan for is this Death Star. And then, and I realize some of you are Star Trek fans, and let me tell you, that's okay. But then I'm going to fly that Death Star to Alderaan, because I had the money to build the Death Star. I built the Death Star. I'm going to fly that to Alderaan, and then I'm going to blow up the planet, and the rebels will be so distraught by that they will just give up. And then the empire will have succeeded in effectively trouncing that rebellion. So what I'm going to purchase, where I'm going to travel to, what the mechanism I'm going to use, or what the specific thing I'm going to do is to accomplish that task. Questions? Yeah.
So if it's not Star Trek, what is this, a Star Wars reference?
This is a Star Wars reference. Thank you, Beth. Yeah.
I think, when it comes to that too, you need to make sure that sitting on a couple panels for grants, you need to make sure that your plan also is very tied closely to the mission and the goals of the organization you're writing for.
Yeah.
It sounds very simple, but it's very, very obvious when you're reading a grant and a proposal that it doesn't look like it's going to line up with the goals and the thought process of the organization. How much are they really going to get in support if you give them the money? So kind of that, we're all here for the same thing, we're all pushing in that direction.
Yeah.
But when that plan has to tie into everything that the college stands for, even if it's not anywhere near your department, it still has to all filter in together. The wildland grant, I had nothing other than the fact that I was hired for it, and I'm glad that I'm here. It has little bits and pieces of every department in the college without it ever known, because I will be dealing with, community affairs, dealing with outreach, dealing with, registration, dealing with all sorts of people that it does touch. So if your grant is worded and looking towards that main goal of the organization, you have that much better chance of being funded, because the people reading it know that you have the support of the organization.
And you're exactly right. And then that also goes back to what we talked about previously, is even before we start into the application process, we're looking again at that RFP, or that description of the potential grant funding, and trying to discern is this a fit for KCC? And what are the specific questions that in the context of that process, the funder is asking us to answer? And so we're always balancing, is this a fit for KCC? Yep, looks that way. Is this really in line with what the funder is specifically referencing or the information that they want to have from us? Well, in some instances, the answer might be no. In which case we say, well, gosh, that looked like it had some potential. It was an opportunity for us, the institution, but it doesn't look like when we get to the fine print, that really is that we aren't going to be able to get there in this context with this funder in this particular grant program. We may need to wait until there's a different opportunity with the same funder, or we may need to move on to another prospect. And so that is always the fine line. And then I think we talked a little bit about it in the last session. We also want to think about, when we get that money, if we get that money, what is our internal and institutional capacity to implement once that's arrived? So if you're saying, well, let's look at the dollars, let's get the resource, let's bring that in, but not thinking about the 24 plus reports that are required from that funder, gosh, then that becomes a challenge once we've received the award notice, and we've got to put that money and that work on the ground. Next, yeah.
When you're working with a funder, especially when you're unfamiliar with, can you see examples of other grants they've approved to get an idea of what they're looking for?
Again, it's really our favorite phrase in the grants department. It depends. Sometimes the answer is yes, and in fact, sometimes in the context of that RFP, in that invite to apply, they'll have some examples that we can reference. Sometimes we don't have examples, but they'll give specific guidance about what you cannot spend on, which is helpful and gives us some additional context in the process. And sometimes they will give you broad project guidance in terms of allowable expense, but not much else. And then sometimes if you've got a relationship with the funder, and I'm looking at Gail because she's got great connections and has helped us out with dynamic conversations with Oregon Community Foundation and others. Sometimes there's a relationship there where we know one of the program officers, or we've got some additional context, and we can have kind of a distinct conversation and get a little guidance from somebody on the inside who will share with us, do this, go this direction, but avoid this other topic at all cost. And so that's where I say, again, not a great answer, but one we use regularly. It will always depend, or it depends on the context, the funder, and all of those components in the process. How are we doing on time? I noticed you haven't come over and given me the high sign yet. Okay.
I would say also that each foundation will have a list of their former grantees. And so, especially when it comes to foundations and their people in our community, you'll know who they are. I would reach out to them and just ask them if they would share their proposal with you. The other thing is with the Oregon Department of Ed, they will have copies of successful former grants online there, and you can see. But I think Peter makes a really good point. I always think about it, it's a jury trial every time, right? Depending on your jury will depend on the outcome. So just because you read a successful proposal that one jury said, yes, you're awarded, it doesn't mean the next jury will give it the same consideration. So I think it really goes back to your own project plan, right?
Yeah.
Right, and the need and the best practices and that makes sense for your own institution. Right.
Yeah, I think that's great. Make sure Gail gets a consultant credit on the.
That's just fine.
I love it. Love it. Yeah, and that's it. I also want to say that we're not always thinking about it in the moment of the application, but we should realize that the likelihood is in our own professional networks, statewide or even nationwide connections, there are often those kinds of resources that we can reach out to as well. So, for instance, Holly and I are part of a monthly meeting in a statewide community college grant writers group. And so it's often a great space to kind of talk through some of the challenges we're having. Sometimes, you know, if somebody has a National Science Foundation that has just sunset, they'll, you know, there's a little competition, but they'll be willing to share context or information or experience, and all of those have value in the process. And I would just reiterate, you know, if we're speaking to our program or our institutional truth, that is the first best path to our effectiveness and to an award. Okay.
You know, and I would just say that what Peter's talking about is really the application, and 80% of your effort is really in the before you write. 20% is the writing. 80% is all the preparation and everything that you need to do to be able to write the proposal, right? And so that gives you a sense of time.
Yeah. So our next slide. Perfect segue, Gail. Thank you. So this is the idea around project timelines. So the timeline internally for us to develop and finalize a proposal is a little different and a little distinct. This is information that we want to be able to provide the funder. So not all of them will ask this, but especially on our construction themed grants, they'll often want to understand, okay, once you have the dollars, what are your next stages, and how do we, your funder, have an assurance that you'll be able to spend this money out in this time frame, and that the next time we visit your campus, because some of them do, that there will be a building there that you'll be able to show us relative to this investment and the effort. And then some version of this, if we're talking about scholarships for students, and we're working towards those students completing a program like Wildland Fire or KSET, that there's a goal and a timeline for them to start to get to a midpoint, and then ideally to complete, and then something we're hearing a lot of more and more often is about placement after a student has gone through the program. So they want to see the successful completion of that certificate or degree, but they also want to see how that transition happens to not just a transfer to a larger institution, which is great information, but also to living wage employer status as well in the context. So our own internal timeline, so that's the timeline for getting the information, for doing the editing, for submitting to the funder, that really starts and then is reverse engineered from the due date that is often referenced in the RFP. And so if HEC, for instance, says the Title II renewal application is due in April, that comes all the way back to this moment and helps us to start putting those benchmarks on the board in terms of what we need to have done by when. And there's usually you know, it's a 42-point font in our calendars that says it's due here. We've got to have it done by here. That means I need information from Bill by this date so that we can incorporate that in that narrative piece. Questions? Okay. And then the final piece and my least favorite as a recovering theater major is budget. And so this really is, sometimes it's our best guess. We have a construction project and we're not even going to break ground for another 2 years. But we've got the information we've got in front of us, and that is the starting place. Sometimes we have costs that are specific and known. So that's at KCC, that can be the cost of admission. Or if it's a specific piece of equipment, we can get a vendor quote that we can put alongside that submission. And I will share that from our process, really, just so we have clarity around roles and responsibilities, a lot of times Holly and I are going to be asking you for that specific information in the course of the process. Now, there are a few things that we have some general guidance on. So if we're saying that in a long-term program, like HEP, for instance, we know we're gonna need staff. We're gonna need, that coordinator. We're gonna need that individual. Well, obviously, we've got some internal information that we can base that request or base that number on. And then there's a formula that we use that says, well, if you've got an individual at this salary, we know that benefits in general are 55 to 60% of that salary. And that gives us a starting place. And then in most instances over the long term, we'll also build in cost of living expense or an inflationary expense as well. So, we know that funding is going to cover us over a period of time and need to be adjusted as we go. And sometimes, and actually COVID is a great example. So in recent years, we've had instances, and HEP is a good example. So we had some significant savings in the grant in travel expense because all the conferences suddenly went to Zoom format, or we just weren't able to get to these various trainings, or folks were working from home in certain instances. And so, gosh, we get to the end of the year in a budget cycle and say we've got all of this money left over. Thankfully, and this is part of the relationship building, with our funders and with the state and federal agencies, and us being able to say, hey, we've got this savings. We'd like to do this other activity or spend out on this other component with these savings dollars. Can we make a formal request? We're able to do that, make that pivot, and then move on down the road. And actually, we've got a similar example of Wildland Fire. Took us a while to bring Preston on board. And so we've got some savings from the first year of that grant, where now we're going to reach back out to that federal agency and say, hey, here's how we'd like to spend out the savings, and we get their approval, and on we go. But at least initially in the context of the application, the more that you can provide or bring to us in terms of what you think those expenses are going to be, especially related to equipment or specific program costs. So for instance, you might have basic tuition, but you might have some specific or specialized fees related to student activity. And so we're counting on you to be able to share that with us. It's always collaborative work, but there's context, there's info that you're going to have just by being in the mix and middle of it. That we're going to be best informed by you. Always better to have as much as possible from your end than for us to take our best guess or make it up. Questions on budget? And there are all kinds of, related to all of this. One is that we always want to invite the conversation. Secondly is that we do have various and assorted templates that we're happy to provide. We also have a number of institutional examples both, if your grant has had a prior iteration, usually we've got an archive of that information. If you're looking at something brand new or something came across your desk and you want to share that out with us, or you want to start the conversation, absolutely willing to connect you to something that might be similar or something from the same agency or funder that might give you some background. So, next slide. And this is actually a example of the construction budget we just submitted for an Oregon Department of Energy grant. Next slide. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. This is our breakdown, which is to say that, you've got your storytelling. Back up. You've got your storytelling. You've got your budgeting that we just talked about. And then our work, the real work of the grants department, is in formatting. Meaning fit it into 12 pages, fit it into 250 words, fit it into the context that the funder wants. Next, please.
So Peter, you're saying,
Yeah.
So 85% is in the formatting, that's not the content?
No, it's a joke slide.
Oh, okay. Really?
And yes, some days it feels like that, especially when you're on a deadline. Yeah. It's good clarification. But these are the things we want to think about, and that's why we oftentimes will initiate with just a conversation. Where are we trying to get to? What's come across your desk that you want us to be involved in looking at? But we're always going to be looking to you. We're always going to be thinking about institutional fit. And after we have those first components, then we're going to be looking at, how we fit, how our stories fit into the context and formatting provided by the funder in particular. And so, and these are the other elements. So, some funders say must be in a 12-point Times New Roman font. If you submit it in Comic Sans, you will be eliminated off the top. In our previous session, we talked about letters of commitment. And so, if you've got an advisory panel, or you've got a business partner, or you've got another campus or community stakeholder that is willing to provide some statement that they support you in the work, that's great. I will say letters of commitment, again, just to reiterate, differ slightly from a letter of support. A letter of support, in my mind, is generally an attaboy, which is to say, KCC is great, the program is great, this work is great, our relationship is great, Klamath Falls is great, and that's all great. But a letter of commitment is really around, we, the community partner or the campus stakeholder, are invested in this activity and the paint done outcome in these specific ways. So we are willing to commit time. In some instances, maybe you've got an employer partner that is willing to take on an intern or a paid job experience individual and is willing to line that out. Or if you've got an agency or a community partner employer that says, gosh, if these students can get their certificate in this particular programming, I'm going to commit to hiring one of these every year, or at least giving KCC students our strongest consideration in the hiring process. That's a little bit of a stretch to ask, but you might periodically run into those kinds of examples, and those are great because it really specifies the level of involvement. And when a funder sees those kinds of things, they really see, aha, you've got institutional infrastructure and capacity to manage this, and you've got external interest in support in the same process. And so submission protocols, we sort of joke about that, but sometimes you have a funder who says, write it up and submit what you got to my work email. And we love those because that is the relationship component. We have funders who say, write it up in these specific ways, in these specific fonts, with these specific page counts, and this checklist of 10 backup documents, and submit it through our specific portal process. And by the way, our portal process is going to limit you to a specific word count or character count, and will not allow you to scroll back and see what you'd previously omitted. So print those pages as you go. And so it again, it depends, and it varies funder by funder, but our work is to navigate that or to support you in navigating that, and on we go. Timelines we talked about, capacity to implement we talked about. Next one.
So Peter, is
Yeah.
it fair to say that all submissions must go through your department?
Yes, it is fair to say.
Okay.
Uh,
I think that would be important to
yeah.
know.
So, and so what she's referring to is we have really amazing colleagues, and we have a number of folks on campus that I'm not going to call out because that would be poor form, and this is being taped. But that have dynamic relationships with funders on their own that they have worked on for years and pre-existed our arrival or my arrival or Holly's involvement or any of the rest of it. And they may feel, hey, I've got writing skills, I've got experience in grants management, I know that I have a reasonable shot of being awarded and that these dollars coming in to KCC are going to make a difference on the students that I'm serving. And actually, we want to encourage that. We think that is phenomenal. But if somebody originates that on their own and doesn't at least make us aware, then what happens is we run into a situation, and we did actually early on when I started, ran into a situation where we had put together a proposal for a foundation funder, and we said, you know, here you go. And their response was, well, you already submitted something pretty similar to this a few weeks ago. Which would you like to be considered? And we went, oh, never mind. Please go with the first one and we'll figure it out from here. Can you give us some context? And so we had to do a little bit of backtracking. And so our goal is that neither we nor the funder nor the agency are ever confused in the process. And so the more that folks feel comfortable reaching out to us and just saying, hey, I'm going to apply for this. I feel like I can do it. I've got the skill sets. I'm going to manage it. Again, we want to encourage that, but we also love to be at least informed in that process. And we'd love for that to be the default, that if you're going to originate something, which we strongly encourage, that you at least reach out and say, hey, Holly, Peter, I'm gonna be working on this. Just wanted to give you a heads up. Next. Actually, go back to that one, sorry. So, review the RFP, double check your bandwidth, please call on us. Next. And so, just the last couple of slides before we wrap up here. Again, this is all about collaborative process, and it's all about process that we've been working on for a couple of years, but it's evolving. Is one thing we want to flag, and obviously in the context of delivering this information, we're learning too, it's evolving too, you can plainly see that. But in essence, here's the way it works. So you say, hey, I saw this opportunity, it looks like a fit for me, it looks like a fit for our program, or this is priority because it's something that has to be renewed in order for us to keep going. And I know we're having a couple of those conversations on campus in this moment. So when you let us know, and hopefully we've had at least one in-person conversation around it, the first thing we do is we'll establish a work folder in SharePoint. And we can show folks where that's at. You can even look at some things that are in progress in this moment. But that first work folder is really where we're gonna put the RFP in there. We're gonna put a checklist in there of the various requirements. If we have email exchange or information that's been shared, that's what in that initial work folder. And it's just a place to start. So everybody's on the same page, has the same references, has similar information. And in that process, we either set the time to review in advance, or we're going to reach out and set that time. Step 3 is that we're trying to, once we have that information, we're trying to go through that RFP or that application. We're reviewing those questions in that process. And so, and we're also thinking about, and we'll reach back out to discuss with you, what are those benchmarks, what are those core components that we've got to have that have to go with the application that we want to try and collect first. So letters of support is a great example. Early on, we can grab those from those stakeholders, the better. We also want to talk about roles and responsibilities. And so as we just kind of went over, we're going to rely on you for a lot of the information about how that program is going to work, the work that you're doing with students, a little bit about those costs, especially if there are specific pieces of equipment. Trust me, you don't want the recovering theater major to estimate what the apprenticeship center is going to cost, right? Otherwise, we never would have got that built. And so, and then, we've got the checklist next. Yep. And you'll notice how subtle this was. So Holly just gave me the time signal, did not come over here and wave her hands. And we're almost there. So the other thing that we're going to do, informed by you, is establish a cutoff. So there comes a period where we have to say, we've either got everything and we're ready to go, and then we're going to go in and we're going to do our grants thing, and that's the hardcore editing. That's reframing those story elements if we think there's some funder or some agency guidance relative to that, and then we're going to start that process of collecting all of that stuff to be ready to send to the particular funder. And as we just went over, in the ideal, we're going to work closely with you. It's going to be a collaborative process, but if it's related to the institution, we grants department would love to be the folks that send that in to the funder or agency, just as part of our protocol and practice related to the work. And then number 6 is, after all of that gets collected and developed and set up and submitted, then we wait. And we wait, and we wait, and we wait, and we wait. And so this is the other piece about the application process, is time management. And that is realizing that even in a situation where we might have a direct connect to a funder like Ford Family or Oregon Community Foundation, that can be 3 months of process. They're going to go through everything we submitted, make sure that we covered all of their elements, all of their requirements. Then that's going to go to a panel review in most cases. And that takes some time to go through. And finally, they're going to make a determination as to whether or not we're funded. And so we get that notice. And then the other thing that sometimes even we forget about is we've got the funding notice, and then we've got 3 months until the funder finally gets the contract elements all figured out. So we've actually got an application that we were noticed of the award back in November. We're still waiting on the final contract piece. And so KCC's business office policy is usually that until we have that final contract, we're not going to start spending against those revenues. We know it says there in the award, but the ideal is to have that contract piece so we know if the money is there and we can start that process. Next. And then we kind of talked about this. So there's the award, celebrate, transition to implementation. If we get declined, we go to the pity party protocols where we all feel bad for a little bit, but then we're going to try and find out more information from the funder. We're going to try and get that feedback from them that says, hey, this is where you could have improved, or you got all of these points, but you missed this point. And that gives us some framing to try again. And then we're going to apply all of those lessons learned and go right back to the process. Next. And there's our cycle again. Next. So that brings us to questions. Any remaining? Okay. Thanks so much.